Okay, hi everyone. My name's Allie, and for some reason you can only see me on the webcam when I'm in this window. So I just want to introduce myself, but you'll be hearing my voice throughout. So I wanted to give a mini lesson on learning disabilities, and so this is one of the 13 disabilities they had on the IDE website, and we have kind of done lessons on it before. And so I want to talk a little bit about it. So just starting off, I want to kind of talk about what a learning disability is. So learning disability is actually kind of a bigger term that describes specific kinds of learning problems that people could have. And you can usually start to see it, in childhood, adolescence, different things like that. Um, but they affect skills like reading, writing, listening, speaking, reasoning, doing math, um, kind of all those kind of things. Um, and other terms that you probably have heard before is dyslexia, which is like words, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. So, sometimes instead of getting mixed up with words, you can mix up the order of things, you can mix up numbers, symbols, different things like that. And learning disabilities are actually pretty common. So, as many as 1 out of 5 people in the US have a learning disability. Um, and there's different signs, right? And so learning disabilities vary from person to person. So there's no sure way, like, there's not one clear sign. Or, certain people might not fall into these certain categories or signs, but some signs that might show themselves is that he or she may have trouble learning the alphabet, rhyming words, or connecting letters to their sounds. They may make many mistakes when reading aloud and repeat and pause often, right? So they might have a hard time comprehending those different things and might take them longer to understand what's being read. And that leads to the next thing, they might not understand what they are reading. They may have real trouble with spelling, right? So the organization of things, dyslexia, I think it was like P and D, or I can't remember, something like that. Um, Kind of flips for them, and so that makes it really hard. Um, and they may confuse math symbols and misread numbers, right? So it doesn't just feel like when people think of like learning disabilities and stuff like that, think that it just has to do with spelling or writing, but it can also, be math. It can be steps in a problem. They may be able to do part of it, but it gets to a certain point and it's just really tough. So this kind of opened my eyes to just how broad a learning disability, could be and how it can really vary. And so there's a section that talks about specific learning disability. So the our idea describes it as a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, manifesting itself in imperfect abilities to listen, think, speak, read, write, or spell. So that includes conditions such as perceptual disabilities, brain injuries, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. An example that I kind of had, so when I was learning about intellectual disabilities, one of the things about lead or mercury poison. Um, but another kind of thing that could lead to learning disabilities was lead poisoning or something like that. And so an example that came to my head when I was thinking about this is like I used to watch this YouTuber, Joey Graceffa, and I remember him talking about his experience as a kid and how he had ingested lead through paint chips, and he'll kind of tell the story and how that affected his growing up and his learning disability. Um, and there's a lot of different things that could impact learning disabilities and stuff like that. Um, but I just want to kind of talk about his um, experience.
Back when I was like 6 years old, I was playing with toys, and by playing, I mean chewing on, and some of them had lead paint chips on them. So while I was chewing on them, I ingested some of the lead paint and I got lead paint poisoning. So, for those of you who don't know what lead paint can do to someone, or especially like for a child, it can really affect like the brain and your learning ability. And I'm going to read you something right here, real quick. It says, even when exposed to small amounts of lead levels, children may appear inattentive, hyperactive, and irritable. Children with greater lead lead levels may also have problems with learning and reading, delayed growth, and hearing loss. At high levels, lead can cause permanent brain damage and even death. So the amount of lead that I ingested was just enough to give me like a learning disability growing up. And it lasted, I think, I'm not really sure when it lasted up until, but it was a long time. I think till I was in like sixth or seventh grade. So basically, what that meant is I was in special education classes all up until sophomore year. And a lot of my friends in high school or just like growing up, they never knew about this. Like, I kept it so secretive because I was so ashamed of it. And I just was really embarrassed that I had a learning disability and I was in special education classes. And now it's something that I don't really talk about to people or bring up because it was a very traumatizing like experience growing up. Just because me, like, I was so judgmental about myself, like worrying about what people were going to think about me. And I mean, some people did make fun of me because of it. Like, I would go to the special education classes where there were kids with Down syndrome and people with a lot worse things than me, but I was put in the same class with them because my school didn't have like that many options. So yeah, it was really hard just like having to.
Okay, so that kind of just gives a little bit of background. Um, and, just stuff like that kind of gives a background to how some students and individuals maybe feel about their learning disability, right? And so he talked about not having enough resources to really do that. So he would go to part of his schedule would be education or general education, part of it would be special education. And kind of that experience he felt, right, of having to hide it. And we don't want our students or individuals to feel like their learning disability is something holding them back. We want to help them um, we want to make it accessible for them to learn just like their peers, and not let that learning disability make them feel like they're different or there's something they should be ashamed of, right? And so there are some things that we can do.
Back
Okay, there you go. So, what services are offered educationally and generally with students with learning disabilities? So, there's a couple of things like there's an evaluation procedure, and so schools should offer those to students, right? And parents should have that option. So, they provide the student with research-based intervention that keeps close track of their performances, and they also have an observation of them in their learning environment just to see how they act and different things they might struggle with. And so once the student is evaluated and found eligible for special education, of course we've been learning about IEPs. IEP is created to work through helping them progress and learn. And there's also supports in the classroom, and I'll talk about teachers and what they can do a little bit later. But there's accessible instruction materials, also called AIM, and there's assistive technology such as tape recorders or even voice recognition systems that can help them to learn better, right? And so I want to just kind of talk about what us, right, as teachers, what educators can do to help, right? Because we are going to have, you saw how common it is. 1 in 5 people having a learning disability. The chances that we have a student who needs maybe extra assistance has an IEP created for their learning disability is going to be pretty high. If you think about how many students you're going to have, how many classes you're going to have. So some things that teachers can do is break tasks into smaller steps, right? If maybe there's a step that's confusing someone or they can get to a certain point, work with the student and break it into smaller steps so they don't feel overwhelmed by everything and they can think clearer, right? If their learning disability is brought on by an overwhelming amount of words they might not understand or have a hard time processing, you want to break it down to them so they can eventually understand it, right? So it kind of becomes easier for them. And you also want to give them more time to finish schoolwork or tests. And it also kind of goes into the last point about learning about different testing modifications. This one is very, very important because that student might take more time to finish their schoolwork, right? They could probably complete that assignment, but they're not going to complete it at the same speed as their peers. Doesn't mean they don't understand or can't comprehend as well. Um, they might just take more time. And maybe if they don't comprehend as well, it might be something as simple as they might need something read aloud to them because they just can't read it very well. And when we don't provide this or think about this, it can really limit their growth and their understanding. And it's important to not write a student off because of a learning disability and think they can never do this. They just have their own way of learning things, and it's really important to work that through. And also, with that, there's a lot of technological things we can do. So, a lot of computers and softwares help with spell checks, grammar checks, and recognizes speech, right? So, it could really help them with their spelling if they're not understanding how to spell a word or write these complete sentences that's grammatically correct. That kind of stuff could really help them. Or recognizing speech if they can't write it down, but they have the thoughts and they have the idea. It's really important that there is software that can help them with that. And then also, of course, always is important to work with the students' parents to create an IEP. IEPs, um, as we're going to create later in this lesson on our case studies, are super important because it really can um, you know, be assigned to help with the students' needs, and it can really help them to be on their steps in their transition to understanding things. And so I really like learning about this because I feel like when you learn about disabilities like that are learning, you just think it's like dyslexia and different things like that, which is true. But it's interesting to also learn about the different ways we can accommodate students and how we can really help them. And we don't ever want them to feel like they should be ashamed of their learning disability or that they can't do something. Um, because of it. Um, and so, yeah, that is just a little bit of a lesson I had about learning disabilities.